Hello guys, how to create APIs in Laravel. There's no specific documentation section for that, there's no specific starter kit in Laravel, so I decided to give an overview in this video in roughly 14 minutes or so to help you get started with the fundamentals of APIs. This will be a shortened version of the fundamentals of my new updated course on Laravel API from scratch, so I reshot the videos, the video version, so all the lessons are video plus text. So the whole course is 1.5 hours plus some text lessons. But in this video, I will try to summarize the main things that you need to know in 14 minutes. But if you want the full course, the link will be in the description below. Let's dive into creating APIs. The first thing you need to know is when you install the Laravel project, there is no API by default. So if you run Laravel new, none of the starter kits are for API projects, so you choose none and then you install API separately, enable that functionality because it's not enabled by default since Laravel 11. So after that installation, if we go to the source code, there's no routes API file, there's only routes web, so you need to enable the API. By default, Laravel assumes that you don't have API and you don't work with API, so you need to run PHP Artisan install API, which will do two things. Install Laravel Sanctum, which we will later use for authentication, including the migration for the tokens, but also, what is more important, as sure if you noticed on the left, now we have routes API file, and the final thing to do with that installation is add Laravel Sanctum has API tokens to user model, again for later authentication. But in the routes, now we have routes API, where exactly we will put our routes for this video. But to finish the installation in the user model, let's have has API tokens, which is auto-completed by my cursor like this. Next, I'll show you how to get the data via API. So this is the database table of categories, and we'll create a route and a controller to get that with the API call. So we make the controller, I specifically specify namespace from the very beginning, and then in the routes API, we do route get categories, controller with index, and controller is used on top. But in fact, it's not correct autocomplete, it's this. Now, in that category controller, in the index method, all you can do is just return eloquent collection, and then Laravel will take care of returning that as JSON. So in your API client, like Postman, for example, you can just launch the URL, which is powered by my Laravel CRUD. The API is the default prefix of all URLs in routes API file, and you just launch get request and get the list of categories with all the columns as they are from the database. But in real projects, you probably want to customize the columns that are returned. For example, return just ID and name and not the timestamps. For that, usually in Laravel, people use so-called eloquent API resources. So we run artisan command make resource with model name resource, and then it generates the file category resource, which should return the array. By default, parent to array, but this is where we override the defaults and return what we want to return from that category model. So for example, we want to return this ID, then this name and timestamps. And in this case, we don't want to return the timestamps at all, so let's leave it like this. And then in the controller, to enable that eloquent resource, we wrap our category all into collection, which should be also added in the use section on top like this. Now if we relaunch our Postman, the same URL, I don't change anything, I just relaunch, we have this changed. In fact, two changes. First, we return only what is specified in the API resource, but also we have a new wrapper layer called data, which is closer to general API standards on the market outside of Laravel, because there may be additional stuff in addition to data like pagination, like other related resources and stuff like that. But if you want, you may disable that. In your app service provider of Laravel project, in the boot method, you may specify JSON resource without wrapping like this. And now if we relaunch the same request, we don't have that data. But personally, I wouldn't advise that. This is kind of a standard, and it's generally good to use market standards for the future. And let me show you that pagination in action that I mentioned. So all you need to do to use pagination from Eloquent is change all to, for example, paginate, by default paginate by 15, but we have only 3 records in the database, so I will do pagination by 2 records, and that's all we need to do. Again, Laravel will take care of providing the structure and the fields automatically, and let's relaunch that and see what happens. First, we have the same data, but as you can see, 2 records only, and then this is the reason why that data separately is useful. On top of data, in addition to data, you have links to all the pages, you have metadata, how many pages are in total, what are the links for pages, the link for next page, and other settings related to pagination. Next, I will show you the full CRUD of API based on the categories, and I already pre-filled the code to save you some time. So to show a specific category, you just return the resource of that category, and this is where category resource is useful because it's reusable. So when you launch get with categories ID 1, this returns ID and name only, and this is all powered by route resource, or in fact separate there's route API resource, which covers 5 methods instead of typical 7, because APIs don't need create form or edit form. So there's only 5 methods: index, show, store, update, and destroy. So I showed you how show works for store method. It's a typical Laravel thing. So if you worked with web Laravel, it's nothing really different. The difference is what you return. So you create the category, you validate the category, and then return what? If you use the same, again, Eloquent API resource with new model created or updated model, then again, the structure is similar. So if you do the post request to add a new category, you send the body name as new category, for example, we send, and we get the data, again, with ID and name using Eloquent API resource. And by default, for this case, for create, Laravel returns 201 HTTP status code instead of just 200, which is in the same 200 success status codes. And this is probably the most important part of working with APIs in general, using correct HTTP status codes, or at least the first number of 2, which means successful, and we'll return to status codes in a minute. For now, I want to show the full CRUD. So this is what happens when you create a new category. Then for patch request or put, it's almost the same, put or patch. Then you do ID here, and then you pass the name of updated category, for example. Then you send, and then it returns the updated category, but this time with 200 OK. And then finally, destroy method. This is kind of interesting. So what do you return after there's no record in the database? It's deleted. Typical thing how developers return data here is response no content, which would return status code 204. Still 2 as the first number, which means success, but no content will be returned, which is probably a good indicator for the front-end client that, well, there's nothing to show. So if we delete the category number 3, for example, we don't need any body in this case, but if we even pass that, it wouldn't be counted. We send, and as you can see, no content here, 204 status code here, and if we try to get that category by ID, we would get 404 not found, which leads me to another tip. If you get HTML as a result, it means that you didn't pass important header. So in the headers of your API client, whichever you use, you do need to pass accept application JSON. Then if you get any error, you get that error in JSON, which is friendly for API client in JavaScript or whichever front end you have. Next, let's talk about validation in Laravel, and this is where we will get back to HTTP status codes. So what happens if we don't pass the name which is required? So in the controller, we have request, form request, which has that rule of validation. By default, Laravel, in case of validation error, will return 422 status code and will provide the list of errors related to those fields, automatically forming the error messages, similarly how it would do on the web, just in JSON structure for the API. And this is okay, this is how it's supposed to work. So your API client would see 422 status code, and the first digit 4 means that the error is on the client side, so some data or some request didn't go well. So they need to fix the error on the front side, like pass different data or pass different endpoint or something like that. But if you don't do the validation on the Laravel layer, for example, let's remove that validation rule, which would lead to SQL query being executed, which will fail because on the database level that category name is required, which then will lead to if we send 500 internal server error. And of course, for production APIs, you would have AppEnv production, so they will not see the SQL error because otherwise it would be a security issue. But generally, when the API client sees 500 error or 5 whatever, then means the error is on the server side. So the front end would need to report to you and you need to fix the error. So it's your job as a backender to do something like this. What I'm saying here is that 400 and 500 status codes are all errors, but different in what should happen after that error. And the list of available HTTP status codes is pretty huge. You can find them on Wikipedia. So there's 200 OK, we saw that, 200 created, and others. But probably you will use in your Laravel projects only a few of them. So I found this shorter list in Laravel docs for HTTP client, which works with external API. And these are the codes generally accepted which have specific methods, which means that those are probably kind of the most probable HTTP status codes to happen. So you need to learn at least those. What do they mean and in what cases do they return these codes? But the basics of HTTP status code is this. I wrote an article on Laravel Daily. This is for premium members, but I will show you the point number 1. The worst practice of API is returning 200 status code if there is an error. You need to always rely either on Laravel automatic validation mechanism or specifically return 422 or 500, whatever is the actual error. There's a classical meme about it, and I found the original on Reddit here. So this is kind of the API client happily receiving the message, but then inside of that message, it says error. Finally, in this video, I will talk about Laravel Sanctum, which is in itself a huge topic, so I will just give an overview from the doc so you would understand the concept, because how you use Sanctum depends on what front end do you use it from. And in the course, I have a separate big section with potentially most popular front ends, Vue.js, Next, Nuxt, and mobile Flutter React Native with repositories, how you would use Laravel Sanctum for those. But in this video, as an overview, so you would understand the concept. If you use Sanctum for API token authentication, it probably means that you have front end separate like JavaScript application like Vue.js or any JavaScript which calls Sanctum to get the API token. This is where use has API tokens from user model is useful, and you have a specific route to generate the token and return it to the front end. And then all the requests from there, from the front end, should contain that token for authentication. And then in your routes, you use middleware auth Sanctum, which would check that token. Then the second way how you would use Laravel Sanctum is for so-called SPA, single page applications, which don't use any token and instead uses Laravel built-in cookie. So that is a separate topic. You need to configure domains, you need to configure middlewares, and then for authentication you need to get so-called CSRF cookie, and then configure some more stuff, but at the end in the routes it's still middleware auth Sanctum, similarly how you would use it in the first way. And then the final way is for mobile application authentication. It's almost the same as the first way. You issue tokens, but in this case you also have the request device name, for example, to assign the token to specific mobile device of the client. And then that mobile device should pass the token as bearer token in authorization header. And on the backend, same thing for protecting routes. In all those cases, it's middleware auth Sanctum to the route or to the route group. So yeah, this is the basic concept of how you use Sanctum and the basic concept of how you use API in general. And this is where I will end this video. So the goal of this video was to get you started with the fundamentals of APIs. You can go and create your APIs. You have enough knowledge, but if you want to get deeper and more practical, again with Sanctum, separate examples, also talking about uploading files, and other features like documentation, versioning, rate limits, and unit testing, I invite you to get the full course available for Laravel Daily Premium members, as well as 80 other courses at the moment. The link to that course will be in the description below. But if you have any more questions about APIs, which I should touch in separate videos here for free on YouTube, let me know in the comments, and let's discuss. That's it for this time, and see you guys in other videos.